The wind carried dust across the empty plains, the kind of dust that clung to a person's boots long after the road was behind them. Clara pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders as she walked, each step heavy, each breath reminding her of the cold creeping down from the mountains. She had come a long way, too far maybe, but the town had no work for her, no place for a widow with nothing but a pair of steady hands and the will to keep moving. Her husband was gone. The fever had taken him quickly, and with him went the little cabin they had built together. His family had claimed the land, leaving her with nothing but a trunk of clothes, a Bible worn thin at the edges, and a small wooden cross she carried in her pocket. She could not go back, and so she kept forward, toward the ranches scattered beyond the river. She had heard whispers of a man named Elias, a rancher who lived apart, who needed help to keep his place in order. Some said he was stern. Others said he was broken by loss and would not let anyone close. When Clara reached the split-rail fence, she paused. The house stood square and silent against the wide stretch of sky. Smoke rose from the chimney, but the windows gave nothing away. She touched the cross in her pocket, whispered a prayer under her breath, and walked up the path. The door opened before she could knock. A tall man filled the frame, his shoulders broad, his jaw set. His eyes, gray like a winter morning, studied her without kindness. "You're the one asking for work," he said flatly. Clara nodded, trying to steady her voice. "I can cook, clean, mend. I'll work hard." He looked past her at the empty road stretching back toward the town she had left. Then he gave a small shake of his head, as though he already regretted opening the door. "I need a housekeeper," he said at last. "Not hope. Do you understand?" The word struck her, though his tone held no cruelty, only a warning. He was a man who had drawn lines around his life and did not mean to cross them. "I understand," she whispered. He stepped aside. The cabin's warmth met her as she entered. A plain but sturdy home, its walls smelling faintly of cedar and smoke. She kept her gaze low, careful not to disturb the silence between them. Elias gave quick instructions: where she would sleep, the pantry shelves, and the work to be done. His words were clipped, measured, and when he was done, he left her standing in the middle of the room as though she were a shadow he had no need to notice. Still, Clara's heart steadied. A roof, a fire, and a chance. It was more than she had dared to hope for when she set out that morning. That night, as the wind rattled the shutters and the plains groaned under the weight of coming winter, she lay awake in the small room he had given her. She thought of the words he had spoken, housekeeper, not hope, and told herself she would not ask for more. She would do her work, earn her keep, and be grateful. Yet as the fire cracked in the next room, and the silence stretched long between them, she felt the heaviness of something unspoken. The storm season had not yet begun, but already the air carried a warning. And in that lonely house on the edge of the plains, Clara understood that her life was about to change in ways she could not yet name. The days settled into a rhythm, though it was a quiet one. Clara rose before dawn, stoked the fire, baked bread, and swept the cabin. Elias kept to himself, speaking only when he had to. He spent most hours outside with the cattle or fixing the fences, his boots carrying dust back into the house at night. He was not unkind, but he was distant. His words came like stone, few, heavy, and without warmth. Clara learned to listen for the unspoken things. The way he placed his tools just so. The way his jaw tightened when he looked at the horizon too long. The way he lingered near the door before coming inside. She wondered what grief lay behind those guarded eyes, but she did not ask. Her own grief lived quietly in her chest, a companion she carried from room to room. She found comfort in small tasks, polishing the lantern until it shone, mending Elias's shirts with neat stitches, humming low songs from childhood as she worked. The silence between them was heavy, but she filled it with steadiness, reminding herself she had chosen to survive. And survival often meant patience. One evening, Elias came in later than usual, the brim of his hat white with frost. "Cold's moving quick," he muttered, brushing snow from his shoulders. Clara glanced at the window. The glass was rimmed with ice, though autumn had barely turned to winter. By the next morning, the storm had arrived. It did not come gently, but with a howl that seemed to rise from the ground itself. Wind slammed against the walls, shaking the cabin. Snow poured from the sky, erasing the fence line, the barn, the road. Clara pressed her hand against the window pane, feeling the cold seep through. She turned to Elias. "Will it pass soon?" He shook his head. "Not soon. Could be days. Could be longer." The truth of it settled heavily between them. Supplies were thin. She had taken stock of the pantry the day before. Flour, a small sack of beans, dried venison, salt. Enough for a while, but not forever. Elias began hauling wood inside, stacking it by the hearth until the pile stood taller than Clara herself. She joined him, wrapping her hands in cloth to keep from freezing as she carried logs. Neither spoke much, but the work bound them together against the storm. By nightfall, the wind screamed so fiercely that Clara feared the roof would lift away. She sat near the fire, clutching her shawl, while Elias checked the shutters again and again. The isolation pressed in, the knowledge that the town was unreachable, that the nearest ranch lay miles away across snow-choked ground. When the firewood crackled low, Clara whispered a prayer into her folded hands, her lips moving silently. Elias, passing behind her, paused. He did not interrupt, but his gaze lingered on her bowed head. His hand twitched as if he meant to reach out, but instead he turned away, pacing the room. The storm did not ease. Hour after hour the blizzard roared, and in its roar came a truth neither of them could ignore. They were alone now, cut off, forced to face whatever days lay ahead within these walls. The storm showed no mercy. For 3 days it beat against the cabin, a wall of white that buried the world outside. The windows frosted over, shutting out even the faintest light. Inside, Clara kept moving because stillness made the fear louder. She measured flour carefully, stretching it thin with melted snow to bake bread. She boiled beans slowly, adding pinches of salt to trick the tongue into thinking it was more than it was. She kept the fire burning, rising at night when the wind dropped the cabin's warmth too low. Elias noticed. At first he said nothing, but his eyes followed her as she worked. Her steady hands, her quiet persistence, the way she never complained though her own body ached from the cold. One evening, as she wrestled a heavy log into place, he stepped forward and took it from her arms without a word. "You'll wear yourself thin," he said gruffly, setting it on the fire. Clara lifted her chin. "We'll both wear thin if the wood runs out. Best we do it together." His gaze lingered a moment, then he gave a small nod. That was the first time she saw it. Just a flicker of something softer beneath his stern face. Still, the days wore hard. The snow blocked the barn door, and Elias fought to dig a path, his breath steaming in the air. Clara joined him, shoveling until her arms trembled. The wind cut their cheeks raw, but side by side they pressed on, until the cattle had water and the horses had hay. Back inside, their silence began to change. It was no longer a wall, but something closer to an understanding. She caught him watching her when he thought she would not notice, his eyes resting on the neat stitching of a mended shirt, or the way she hummed softly by the fire. He never smiled, but the edges of his voice grew less sharp. One night, as the storm raged, Clara's hands shook from weariness. She fumbled with the bread dough, nearly spilling it. Elias stepped forward, covering her hands with his large, calloused ones. For a heartbeat, the cabin grew still, the only sound the storm howling outside. "Let me," he said quietly. His touch was brief, but it lingered in her chest long after he pulled away. She did not thank him out loud. She simply placed the loaf by the fire, her breath catching in her throat. Something unspoken had shifted between them, fragile but real. The blizzard did not ease. Nights blurred into days, and the cabin became both prison and refuge. Clara found herself reading her worn Bible aloud, her voice steady in the firelight. At first Elias sat apart, his eyes fixed on the flames, but gradually he began to listen. His shoulders loosened. His hands stilled, and once when she glanced up, she thought she saw something raw flicker across his face, like a man remembering hope against his will. It was not warmth yet, not trust, but it was something. And in the heart of that storm, where silence and snow pressed against the walls, Clara felt the first fragile thread of connection tying them together. The storm pressed on, as if winter itself had chosen their cabin for its trial. Each morning Elias checked the drift piled high against the door, and each morning Clara prayed it might ease. But the snow only deepened, sealing them off from the world beyond. The days became a rhythm of survival. Clara managed the food, counting every bean, every crumb of bread. She found ways to stretch meals, boiling broth from bones, thickening stew with scraps of flour. Elias began to notice her care. One night when he set down his bowl, he spoke without looking at her. "You make little go far," he muttered. Clara glanced at him, startled. Praise was rare in his mouth. She gave a small smile. "It's the only way to last through a storm." His eyes lifted for a moment, then dropped again. Yet something softened in the air between them. They began working side by side more often. When the wind dropped for a few hours, they hauled buckets of snow inside to melt for water. Their hands brushed in the passing of tools, and though neither spoke of it, the touch lingered longer than it should have. At night, the silence grew easier. Elias sat closer to the fire now, his boots stretching toward the warmth. Clara would hum softly, mending a shirt or darning a sock, and though he never joined, he listened. Once, when she paused, he asked her to continue, his voice low but certain. Still, his guard held firm. She saw it in the way he stiffened whenever she came too near, or the way he pulled back into himself when her eyes met his for too long. Something in him feared closeness more than the storm outside. One evening, while tending the fire, Clara noticed Elias at the window. He stood motionless, his shoulders tense, staring at the endless white. She approached quietly. "Do you think it will break soon?" she asked. He did not turn. "Storms don't break easily. Neither do some things." She heard the weight in his voice, the heaviness of wounds unspoken. She wanted to ask, to bridge the distance with words, but she stopped herself. Instead, she laid another log on the fire and let the warmth speak in her silence. That night the wind screamed louder than before, rattling the walls. Clara's small room grew colder by the hour, until her breath clouded in the dark. She pulled her shawl tight, but it was not enough. At last she rose and went to the hearth where the fire still burned. Elias sat in the chair, half asleep, his head resting against his hand. He stirred as she settled near the fire, blinking awake. For a moment their eyes met across the flames. Neither spoke, but the air seemed to shift again, carrying something unspoken between them. He said nothing, simply pulled the quilt from his chair and handed it to her. Clara took it, her fingers brushing his. It was a small gesture, but in that cabin, with the storm roaring outside, it felt like the first true crack in the wall he had built. And though neither dared name it, both of them felt it, the quiet beginning of something neither had asked for but both had begun to need. The storm kept its hold. Days blurred together, white skies and endless wind, but inside the cabin something had begun to change. Where once there had been silence edged with distance, now there was silence filled with presence. Two people moving around each other, not as strangers but as companions. Clara rose early, as always tending the fire. One morning when she reached for the heavy pail of water, Elias stepped in before she could lift it. "I'll take it," he said firmly. She opened her mouth to argue, then saw the look in his eyes. It was not command but care, though he spoke it in the only way he knew. She let him carry the weight, and in return she laid her hand on the table, steadying the bread dough she was kneading. Their unspoken exchange said more than words. They worked as a team now. When Elias chopped wood in the freezing wind, Clara held the lantern and stacked the logs. When Clara mended clothes until her eyes stung, Elias fetched more light, setting it close without a word. Their movements became a quiet rhythm, each filling the other's gaps. One afternoon, while sorting the shelves, Clara found a tin box pushed to the back. Inside were faded papers, a ribbon, and a photograph of a woman holding a small child. She froze, the air catching in her chest. Elias entered then, and his eyes fell on the open box. For the first time since she had known him, his face cracked, grief raw and unhidden. He took the box gently from her hands and set it aside. His voice was low, almost rough. "They're gone. Fever took them." Clara's heart clenched. She did not press him with questions, only bowed her head. "I'm sorry," she whispered. He gave a stiff nod, retreating into silence again. But the wall between them had thinned. She had seen his wound, and he had let her. That night she placed her small wooden cross on the mantel beside his tin box. She did not say why, but the meaning hung in the air. 2 lives marked by loss, placed side by side, Elias noticed. His eyes lingered on the cross, then on Clara, though he said nothing. But his silence carried a different weight now, not rejection, but a slow, reluctant trust. As the storm dragged on, sickness crept in. Clara's hands grew cold and her cough deepened. She tried to hide it, moving quickly between chores, but Elias saw. One evening, when she nearly dropped the kettle, he caught it from her hands and guided her to the chair by the fire. "Enough," he said firmly. "You'll rest," she shook her head. "There's too much to do." His gaze was steady, unyielding. "Then I'll do it." "You've done enough." Clara's breath caught. For the first time his words held something more than caution. They held care, sharp but real. The storm outside roared on, but in that moment, Clara felt a different storm stirring within. Elias had set his rule the day she arrived. Housekeeper, not hope. Yet in his eyes now she saw that rule bending, breaking under the weight of what they had come to mean to each other. The storm had lasted longer than either of them expected. Snow lay heavy against the cabin walls, so high that it covered the windows. The path to the barn was little more than a tunnel Elias dug out each day, and even that filled again by nightfall. Inside, the fire burned low, and their supplies ran thinner. Clara worked carefully, cutting portions smaller, finding ways to make the last of the beans stretch. She did it without complaint, but Elias could see the hollowness in her cheeks, the way her shoulders sagged when she thought no one was watching. One evening, as she bent over the pot, her hands trembled so hard the spoon slipped and clattered against the floor. She steadied herself on the table, but her face had gone pale. Elias was beside her in an instant, his rough hand steadying her shoulders. "You're burning yourself out," he said, his voice sharper than he meant. "Sit down." Clara shook her head. "We can't afford—" His hand tightened. "Sit." She sank into the chair, breath uneven. Elias knelt beside her, his eyes searching her face. Her skin was hot to the touch, fever bright in her cheeks. Panic surged in him, swift and fierce. "You're sick," he muttered. "You've been sick and you didn't tell me." Clara tried to smile, though it wavered. "I thought it would pass." Elias rose quickly, moving through the cabin with a kind of urgency Clara had never seen in him. He brought water, soaked cloths, and pressed them to her brow. He fed the fire until it roared, then sat beside her, his hand lingering near hers but never quite touching. As night deepened, Clara drifted in and out of restless sleep. She whispered fragments, memories of her husband, prayers half-formed. Elias listened, every word cutting into him. He had sworn never to open his heart again, never to feel the sharp edge of loss. Yet now, watching her chest rise and fall with effort, he felt fear coil tight inside him. By dawn, her fever had grown worse. Elias stood at the door, staring out at the endless white. To reach the nearest neighbor meant miles through blizzard and drifts higher than a man's chest. To stay meant risking losing her here alone in his care. His hands curled into fists. He had lost before, wife, child, family, and each loss had carved him hollow. He had built walls to survive it. But now, staring at Clara's still form by the fire, he felt those walls cracking, crumbling. He turned back, his voice breaking in the stillness. "You're not just a housekeeper," he whispered, though she could not hear him. "You're the only hope left in this place." It was a confession spoken to the fire, to the storm, to the God he had stopped calling on long ago. And it was the truth he could no longer hold back. As the blizzard roared outside, Elias knelt beside Clara, pressing the cloth to her forehead, willing her to fight. For the first time in years, his hardened heart begged not for strength but for mercy, that she would not be taken from him too. The storm did not let up. Snow hammered the cabin roof, wind howled through the cracks, and the cold crept in no matter how hot Elias fed the fire. Clara lay weak on the cot, her breath shallow, her face pale against the quilt. Each time her eyes fluttered open, she tried to whisper that she was fine, but her voice was barely a thread. Elias paced the room, restless. He was a man who had always met hardship with his own strength, but this was different. He could mend fences, break horses, and fight the land into submission, but he could not wrestle fever from her body. At last, he stopped pacing and stared at the door. Beyond it lay the wild storm, miles of snow and danger. Somewhere past that white wasteland lived neighbors, medicine, and help. The risk was certain. To go out could mean death. Yet to stay meant watching Clara slip away. He pulled on his coat, his jaw tight. Clara stirred when she heard the creak of the door. Her eyes opened weakly, finding him. "You can't," she whispered, her words soft and broken. "The storm, it will swallow you." Elias knelt beside her, his hand hovering over hers. He wanted to speak the truth aloud, that losing her was the one thing he could not bear. But the words caught in his throat. Instead, he said, "I'll come back. You hold on till then." Her eyes closed again, and Elias rose, pulling the door open. The storm hit him like a wall, snow blinding, wind tearing at his coat, cold slicing through his skin. He forced his way out, every step sinking to his knees, every breath a battle. The world outside was endless white. No road, no horizon, only the howl of wind and the pounding of his own heart. He pressed forward, driven not by duty, not by pride, but by something he had long denied. The need to save the one soul who had broken through his silence. Hours seemed to pass in that storm, though it might have been minutes. He fought drifts taller than himself, stumbled, rose again. His body screamed for rest, but the thought of Clara's still face pulled him on. He called out into the wind as if the storm itself could hear. Not her. Don't take her too. At last, through the blur of snow, a lantern's glow appeared. A rancher's cabin, half buried but standing. Elias pounded on the door, collapsing when it swung open. He gasped out the words, medicine, fever, help, before darkness pulled him under. When he woke, heat touched his skin. A fire burned nearby, and a neighbor's rough voice spoke. "We'll see her through. Storm's breaking soon." Relief washed through him, sharp as the cold had been. He had risked everything, thrown himself against the blizzard's fury, but he had not done it for survival alone. He had done it because for the first time since his losses he feared a different kind of emptiness, the kind that would come if Clara were gone. The world outside began to change. Slowly, the blizzard that had trapped them for so long loosened its grip. The wind calmed, the snow fell more softly, and through the gray sky a weak light returned. What had seemed endless was at last breaking. Elias returned to his own cabin with the neighbor carrying medicine and blankets. His body ached from the storm's beating, but his thoughts were only of Clara. He pushed through the door and found her still by the fire, her face pale, her lips dry. For a terrible moment, fear seized him. What if he had been too late? Then her eyes fluttered open. Weak but alive, she saw him, and for the first time in days a faint smile touched her lips. "You came back," she whispered. Elias dropped to his knees beside her, setting the medicine down with shaking hands. "Of course I came back," he said, his voice rough. "I'd have torn through the whole storm if I had to." The neighbor helped prepare a simple tonic, coaxing Clara to sip it. The bitter liquid slid past her lips, and slowly the fever began to ease. Elias stayed close, his hand hovering near hers, as if even in her weakness she might slip away if he did not guard her. Hours passed. Clara drifted in and out of sleep, But each time her eyes opened, she found Elias watching. No longer the distant man who had warned her at the start. Housekeeper, not Hope, but a man stripped bare, his guard broken by the storm. At one point her voice rasped low. Why did you risk yourself like that? Elias swallowed hard. The words he had buried for years pressed against his chest. Because I've already lost too much, he said softly. And I couldn't lose you too. Her hand, thin and trembling, reached for his. He caught it gently, holding it as if it were the only thing anchoring him in the world. No more walls, no more distance. Only truth, fragile and new, yet stronger than the storm that had tried to tear them apart. For days after, he tended to her with a care that surprised them both. He fed the fire through the night, cooled her fever with cloths, and stayed close whenever she stirred. She gained strength slowly, the color returning to her cheeks, her cough easing with each sunrise. The neighbor, seeing the change, shook his head with a smile. Storm near killed the land, he said one morning, but it may have given you both something worth keeping. Elias said nothing, but his eyes fell on Clara. She caught his gaze, and in that quiet exchange lay a promise, unspoken but certain. The snow outside began to soften under the sun, breaking into streams that ran down the hillside. Birds returned to the trees, their calls sharp against the silence that had ruled for so long. The world was waking, and so were they. For Clara, the storm had been a trial of survival. For Elias, it had been a breaking and a rebuilding. What he had thought dead within him stirred back to life, fragile but real. And sitting by the fire, with Clara's hand in his, he knew the words he had spoken before, housekeeper, not hope, had been buried in the snow along with the storm. The storm finally ended. The sky cleared, showing wide stretches of blue that seemed brighter than Clara remembered. Snow still lay heavy across the land, but the fierce winds were gone. In their place came silence, the kind that felt peaceful instead of threatening. Neighbors began to arrive, checking one another's cabins, bringing word from town. Wagons rolled slowly across the snow-packed trails, horses steaming in the cold. When they reached Elias's ranch, they found the drifts piled high and the fences bent under the storm's weight. But smoke still rose steadily from the chimney. Elias opened the door to greet them. For the first time in years, his voice carried warmth as he invited them inside. Clara sat by the fire, still pale but gaining strength. The neighbors were surprised to see her there, for they had heard only whispers before, that Elias lived alone, that he kept the world at arm's length. Yet now his eyes turned to her often, and his hand lingered at her shoulder as he guided her to sit more comfortably. The neighbors noticed, but none spoke. They could see enough in the change upon his face. One man clapped Elias on the back. Thought the storm would finish us all. But it seems you weathered it better than most. Elias gave a small smile, rare and real. Not by my strength, he said quietly. By hers. Clara's cheeks flushed, though her eyes shone. She busied herself with pouring water into cups, but her hands trembled. Not from weakness now, but from the weight of his words. As the neighbors spoke of rebuilding fences and sharing supplies, Clara listened, her heart steadying. She realized she was no longer a stranger in this place. The storm had tied her to it, tied her to him, in ways deeper than she had ever imagined when she first knocked on his door. When the neighbors left, Elias closed the door behind them and stood for a long moment in the quiet. Clara looked up from the hearth, waiting. He crossed the room slowly, as if each step carried more weight than he had ever borne. When he reached her, he did not speak at once. Instead, he knelt, his rough hands folding gently over hers. I told you once I wanted no hope here, he said, his voice low. But the truth is, you've been my hope all along. This house, this life, without you, it's nothing but walls. Clara felt her breath catch. For so long she had guarded her own heart, certain that he would never let her near. Yet here he was, laying down his walls, opening what he had sworn shut forever. Tears blurred her vision, but her smile was steady. Then we'll keep it together, she whispered. Not just a house, but a home. Outside, the snow began to melt, slow rivers forming in the sunlight. The land, scarred by the storm, was waking again. And inside the cabin, two lives once marked by loss were finding something new. Something that had grown not in calm or comfort, but in the fiercest of winters. Spring came slowly to the plains. The snow melted first in streams, then in wide patches of brown earth. Shoots of green began to push through, stubborn against the cold. The land that had seemed buried beyond saving was alive again, softened by the touch of the sun. Clara walked the yard one morning, her shawl wrapped close. The fences were broken. The barn roof sagged from the weight of snow, yet she saw promise in it all. Each broken place was something to be mended, and she no longer faced it alone. Elias joined her, his stride steady beside hers. He had been a man of silence, but now his silence carried something new. Companionship, not distance. When she paused to lean against the fence, he placed his hand gently over hers. They stood together, not speaking, but the gesture said enough. Neighbors still came by, offering help, bringing news. Each time they left, they carried stories of how Elias had changed. Once known as a man closed off, now he was seen as one who had found his way back into life. Some said it was the storm that had done it. Others said it was the woman who had come at the start of winter, carrying nothing but a trunk, a Bible, and the will to endure. Clara knew the truth. The storm had not broken them, it had revealed them. It had shown Elias that his heart was not as dead as he feared, and it had shown her that she could still find home after loss. One evening, as the sun fell behind the hills, Elias set a chair by the fire for her and sat across from her. The flames painted his face in soft light. He reached into his pocket and drew out the tin box she had once found. He opened it, setting the faded photograph on the table. "They'll always be part of me," he said quietly, "but so are you now. And I don't aim to lose either." Clara touched the cross that rested near the photograph. "We carry our grief," she whispered, "but we don't have to carry it alone." Their eyes met across the firelight, steady and sure. No vows were spoken, no grand words made. Yet in that moment their bond was clear, born not of chance but of hardship, of survival, of choosing one another when the world pressed hardest against them. The storm had changed every rule. He had said housekeeper, not hope, but in the end she had become more than hope. She had become his partner, his home, the proof that even in the bleakest winter love could rise like spring from the frozen ground. Outside, the prairie stretched wide and quiet. The air carried the smell of thawing earth, the promise of planting, of new life waiting to grow. And inside the cabin, Clara and Elias sat together in the warmth. No longer two lives bound by loss, but two hearts bound by the promise of what lay ahead. If you enjoyed this story from the frontier, don't forget to subscribe to Shadow Frontier Tales for more Wild West tales of grit, love, and redemption. Hit the bell so you never miss the next journey into the old frontier, and share this story with someone who loves a good Western romance.